Okay, so this week we are going to shift our focus and begin talking about something called the Industrial Revolution. And we're going to talk about the two different regions, specifically the North and the South, and how their needs for their economies were very different from each other, and how those different needs would eventually lead to the Civil War in the United States. So for this week, we'll concentrate on the North, and next week we'll look a little bit closer at the South, and we'll look at the differences between the two. So again, we'll start by looking at the North this week. And the picture you can see on the PowerPoint here is of a father and son and some small boys that are working in a factory. And much of what the Northern economy was all about was factories and making things. And so that's what leads us to the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution is known as the period from about 1760 to 1860, about a 100-year period, where machines were used for manufacturing and production. And those machines being used for manufacturing and production changed the American economy drastically. And the picture that I have here on the right-hand side of the page is of Cornwall iron furnace, which is still there today in Lebanon County, and you can go visit it. It's one of the oldest iron furnaces in the country. It doesn't operate anymore, but it is a museum, and you can go take tours, and a very big part of Lebanon County history. So in order to get to the Industrial Revolution, we had to start with something called mass production. And we had to find ways to produce the same thing over and over and over again. If you buy a new iPhone today, that iPhone is mass produced. There are millions and millions and millions of those iPhones produced. And in order to do that, there's some things that you have to have. And the first thing you need to have is interchangeable parts. You have to have parts to that iPhone that are all the same. So if something breaks on my iPhone, they can actually replace the part itself. The other thing you have to have is machine tools. These are tools that are made for machines to use instead of for humans to use. So a lot of mass production happens when machines are putting certain parts into the thing that you're buying. So when you buy an iPhone, there are machines that are making most of that iPhone. Most of that is not interacted with by a human being. It's a machine that's doing the work for you. Think of a conveyor belt carrying items down the line, okay? And that's kind of how it works. The third thing that you need for mass production is you need a division of labor. And so that is, just like it says here, work is divided into separate tasks where different people do different things. So if you think about your iPhone being put together, there's a person that is watching the assembly line where the battery is put in, and there's a person in charge of where the processor goes into your iPhone. And each part is put together in that way. The screen is put on by a certain person or a certain machine that the person is supervising to make sure the machine is doing its job. And that's kind of how mass production works. The way that we got to mass production is we had a couple of really important people that started this idea of mass producing goods. And the first guy we're going to talk about today is Samuel Slater. And Samuel Slater was a British mechanic, and he basically memorized designs for textile machines in Great Britain, and he came over to the United States and brought them here, and he expanded on them. So he worked in Great Britain as a mechanic in a factory, and they were very secretive about how they produced goods. And Samuel Slater decided he could get in on some of this action if he opened his own business in the United States. So he memorized the designs of some of the machines, and he came to the United States and he opened his own factory to start. If you don't already know what textiles are just manufactured cloth items. So the clothing that you're wearing right now is a textile. It's a manufactured cloth item. Slater, once he gets here, basically created his own system for how he would run his factories. And the system he called, or someone called, the Rhode Island system. The first one I think was located in Rhode Island. But basically what Slater did was he would recruit whole families to come and work in the factory. So mom and dad would both work in the factory. Any kids who are above the age of 6, 7, 8 years old, something like that, would also come and work in the factory, because there were certain jobs that only smaller-bodied people could do. And so younger kids were good for those jobs. Now, those jobs were often very dangerous, and people could get hurt in the factories, but Slater wanted to appeal to the whole family coming and living in one of these, where one of these factories was. So he even created and built like dormitory type housing, like this picture that you see in the upper right hand corner, where parents could live. They could rent out from the factory a room for their family to live in, and within that dormitory style housing. We also had another inventor there during this time named Eli Whitney. And Eli Whitney invented lots of things, but the most important thing he invented was the cotton gin, which was one of the first inventions to really use the idea of interchangeable parts. That if something broke, there was another part that was identical that you could replace it with without having to build the part yourself. And the cotton gin, of course, made cotton harvesting much easier, and it also led to a higher want of slavery from those southern states, and eventually that would help lead to the Civil War. One more person that we want to talk about on this page is Richard Arkwright. Richard Arkwright was an inventor, and he invented something called the water frame, and that harnessed the power of a stream or a creek or a river, and it used that power to basically create energy to run looms and spinning wheels in textile mills that he would build along the river. Samuel Slater used some of this technology as well. So Slater invents the Rhode Island system, and then there was also something called the Lowell system, which was a little different. In this slide, we're going to really compare and contrast the two. The Rhode Island system was Slater's model. He wanted the whole family to come. So it was located in Rhode Island. He might take out advertisements in newspapers in South Carolina and Georgia and Virginia and Pennsylvania and Maryland and all over the United States and Kentucky, and hope that people would come as a whole family to Rhode Island to work in his mills. And most of the time, the people that would come and work in the Rhode Island system were often paid in store credit or company credit. So that would mean that the company, the Samuel Slater's mill, would have their own store where you could buy goods. They would also, again, like I mentioned before, you could live in their housing, like a dormitory style house, apartment. And so you would get paid in credit from the company. So the credit would be you get so much food, and you get so much, you get paid your rent to stay in our dormitory housing, and then you get so much credit to use at the store to buy goods that you need. Oftentimes they would not be paid in cash. The adults, they would make up to 5 times as much money as the children, which, considering that they were both working very hard, was oftentimes pretty unfair. And many families, once they got into the mill life, once they got into the Rhode Island system, they found it difficult to get out of it, difficult to escape. They were stuck in that system. The Lowell system was a little different. The Lowell system actually was a lot different. The Lowell system decided to target young unmarried women from local farms and local communities. And so they would put out newspaper advertisements for young women who had not become married yet and who were still living with their parents on the family farm or the family business to come and work at the Lowell mills. And what they would do is they would pay women $2 to $4 per week. $1.25 of that would be used for their room and board to stay at the Lowell house where they were staying. But a lot of women really enjoyed this and really thought it was a way for them to discover some independence. They did work long hours, usually Monday through Friday, 10 or 12 hours a day. But many women really were excited about the idea that they could make their own money, not be relying on their parents or on their husband or something like that. Most of the Lowell girls worked about 4 or 5 years in these factories, and then they got married or got another job and moved on to the next thing. So some of the differences between the Rhode Island system and the Lowell system you can see from the bullet points. The last bullet point, many families in the Rhode Island system were stuck there for life, whereas the Lowell girls, most of the time, they were able to move on either by getting married or getting a different job. And obviously the difference in who's working in the factories, with the Lowell system, you only have young women working there. With the Rhode Island system, you have the whole family working there. And the Lowell women were paid in cash every week, whereas in the Rhode Island system, oftentimes they were paid on company credit, which they were unable to use for anything other than the company store and their rent. So some major differences between the two systems. Here's a couple of pictures of the systems. You see the women working here in the Lowell system on the left, and they are working in the factory. And then on the Rhode Island system on the right here, you can see a picture from what it might have looked like. You see in the background is probably the mill, and you have these different areas of housing that would have been this, as I mentioned, dormitory style housing that you could have taken part in. Now, something that was happening at the same time as the Industrial Revolution was called the Transportation Revolution. And the Transportation Revolution was very important because it helped people move from one place to another much faster. Okay, travel became faster and easier as new technology transforms the way Americans travel. So the two pictures you see here are the steamboat and the steam engine train, and both of those were huge. The steamboat now allowed people to work their way up rivers against the current with some level of speed, versus before you would have to wait for the wind to blow you up the stream, or you'd have to row or paddle or push your way. And that took a long time. If you remember, about a month ago we talked about Lewis and Clark. And when Lewis and Clark were exploring the Louisiana Purchase, when they went up the Missouri River, they were going against the river the whole way. Sometimes they would only make 3 or 4 or 5 or 8 miles a day to go against the river, to move on. And now with the steamboat and also with the steam engine locomotive or the train, you were able to make much greater distances in a shorter amount of time. So let's first talk about steamboats. On the left there you see a model of one of the first steamboats that was invented by, there's some debate about this, whether it was a guy named Robert Fitch or a guy from Lancaster named Robert Fulton. We're going to go with Robert Fulton. He was born in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and he invented the steamboat in 1803 while he was in France. And he called that first steamboat, the first full-size commercial steamboat was called the Clermont. And that steamboat traveled in the United States up the Hudson River in 1807, and that was the first time a steamboat was able to travel against the current up the river, and that happened in 1807. The name of that steamboat was the Clermont. By the 1850s, so only 50 years later, there were thousands of steamboats that were in use, thousands of them. Steam-powered trains, on the other hand, they started with a guy named Peter Cooper. He built something called the Tom Thumb, the first steam engine locomotive. And you see a drawing of it here, a painting of it on the right-hand side. And people thought he was crazy. People thought he was crazy to try to invent this machine that would move. And so he decided to put on a public show, and there was people in the community that challenged him to race his steam locomotive against a horse and see if it would be better than a horse. And basically what happens is the race happens, and the Tom Thumb, is competing with the horse. It's neck and neck with the horse, and at the very end, right before the finish line, the Clermont runs out of steam, or runs out of power, or breaks, and the horse wins the race. But it proved that the Tom Thumb, it proved that the steam locomotive could stick with the horse, and that it was the future of the way things are going. In fact, by 1860, there's 30,000 miles of railroad track in the United States. And the early trains went all the way up to 20 miles per hour, which may not seem like a lot to you or me because we drive cars around today at 65 or 70 miles an hour. But 20 miles an hour back then was unbelievable. Some of the first people that rode in these steam engine trains became sick from motion sickness of being on the train. Think about how you might get after riding a roller coaster or something like that. Some of these people actually became sick from riding the train, which is pretty funny to think about when we're thinking in our perspective of today when we drive 65 or 70 miles an hour. But at 20 miles an hour, this was faster than most of the people, than anybody really in the United States had ever moved before in any vehicle. So it was incredible to have that sensation of moving that fast. The other thing that was going on during the Industrial Revolution is there was new resources being used. And so because the Transportation Revolution and the Industrial Revolution allowed more goods to be moved by trains and steamboats, you had these new natural resources that were unearthed that weren't really thought about before because, or they were known of, they just didn't know how to move them from place A to place B. Well, one of those natural resources is something known as king coal or coal, and we've all probably heard of this because coal is big in our area. Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Illinois had huge deposits of anthracite coal that were mined and shipped all across the country. In fact, we have coal deposits right here in central Pennsylvania, just north of us. There are quite a few coal deposits that are still there, and there are some mines that are still in place in Pennsylvania. Most of the mines now are in southwestern Pennsylvania and West Virginia, where there are still coal mines operational to this day. A couple more important people when we're talking about inventions from this Industrial Revolution. One of them is Samuel Morse, and Morse invents the telegraph, and the telegraph would end up leading to something that most of you probably have, which is the telephone. The telegraph was a way for people to communicate using wire and back and forth. Now today we are able to use telephones without wires because the technology has developed over time. Another thing that was invented was a steel plow. This was invented by a guy named John Deere. Yes, it's the same John Deere that the tractors are named after. He invents a much stronger steel plow that can now plow through hard earth that was not able to be penetrated before by the iron plow. But the steel is much stronger, it's much harder, and you can now plow through much harder earth, which is a big deal because out west the soil was not very soft. And with the steel plow, if you were in the Midwestern United States in, let's say, Iowa or Kansas or Nebraska, and you were having trouble plowing your land, you get a steel plow and now you're good to go. Another invention was from Cyrus McCormick. He invents something called the mechanical reaper, which increased crop production. He also sold his products on credit and repaired and serviced them and advertised, which were all new concepts. So you bought a mechanical reaper from Cyrus McCormick and something went wrong, you took it back into him and he would fix it up for you, and at a fee, obviously he would charge you for it, but he would fix your reaper for you. He also, as I mentioned, he sold products on credit, so you could go in there and you could get a mechanical reaper by putting so much money down, and you'd have to pay the rest over time, but you would have to pay the rest with interest, so McCormick would make money out of the deal. The mechanical reaper, I'll show you a picture of it on the next slide, but basically it helped you cut your hay or other grassy type things that you had as crops, and it laid them down in nice neat piles for you as you cut them. And the final invention was invented by Isaac Singer. He made improvements to the recently invented sewing machine. He really wasn't the inventor, but he made it better. He made the sewing machine better. So let's take a look at some pictures of these four things. Here's the telegraph up here in the corner, the left-hand corner. And you can see this kind of early version of the telegraph. Looks much different than the cell phone that you probably have sitting beside you right now. The steel plow is right here, John Deere inventing the steel plow. And you can see that it has a very bulky look to it, but once you hook the plow up to a horses or oxen or a mule, they could pull that plow across your hard ground. Mechanical reaper is down here in the left-hand corner, and you can see the mechanical reaper. It has these blades on it that rotate around in kind of a circular pattern, and then they drop out the hay or the grass or whatever you're cutting in nice neat piles. And then down here you see a very old sewing machine as well. Okay, that's an overview of the Industrial Revolution, which we're going to talk about again. That's kind of an overview of what the Industrial Revolution was all about. That's kind of this week's topic, and that's going to give you information that will help you when you go to do your invention project that you're going to pick and do later this week, or for an assignment this week as well. So go ahead and take the quiz that goes along with this video, and make sure that when you take the quiz, that if you're not sure about something, go back and recheck it on the video. Just move the video back and kind of check the video as you go to make sure that you're getting the right answers for the quiz. Okay, so take the quiz, and then you'll have a chance to work on your invention project.